Yeah.
Thank you very much. I notice, Sir Philip, that you introduced yourself as Permanent Under Secretary of the FCDO. You didn't use the somewhat traditional title of Head of the Diplomatic Service.
I have two titles. I'm also Head of the Diplomatic Service, but my formal departmental role is Head of the Merged Department of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office.
Okay, I think that may be an issue we refer to later. Look, the National Security Advisor described the UK's evacuation as a qualified success, which did not in any way undershoot our original ambitions. Would you agree?
So the way in which I would characterise it, the first thing to say is, the UK's been involved in Afghanistan, particularly for 20 years plus, and we owe a deep debt to our military who helped to keep the country safe, and diplomats and development experts who work with them alongside other civilians. No one wanted our engagement and our presence in Afghanistan to end in the way that it did. I'm sure you'll get on to Chair what came about and why it came about. We had seen the eventual Taliban takeover of Afghanistan as the most likely outcome of the NATO withdrawal. That was our central assessment, as you know. But no one, including the Taliban themselves, foresaw the speed that happened. Our main effort was to try and avoid that happening and to secure a better outcome, some sort of negotiated power-sharing deal. But we also worked in parallel on our contingency plans and accelerated those as time passed after the US decision had been confirmed by President Biden in April. We were looking at an alternative diplomatic presence. We were also working up our contingency planning for a military evacuation. It was, for us as a department, but also I think across government, one of the most complex and challenging crises we've had to face for the short period that we were evacuating people. And we did, as you know, successfully, enabled by the military who were on the ground providing security, but alongside our Home Office and Border Force colleagues, evacuate more than 15,000 people, but we all wish we could have evacuated more. Everyone involved, those on the ground under Sir Laurie's leadership, I'm sure the military, all of the people working at the UKN wish we got more out than we were able to in the time we had. But that work carries on now, and since the end of the evacuation period, we've helped more than 3,000 people to leave Afghanistan who have entitlement to come to the UK. And final thing to say, Chair, again, I think you'll come on to this, is, as with all big crises, there are lessons to be learned, and we're in the process of doing that as a department, and I'm happy to go through that with you and the committee in response to your questions later on. But that's a slightly long answer, because how I would basically describe my feelings about what happened.
Okay, so what stage did you understand the full extent of the challenge?
So I think all along we were hardening up our assessment of what was going on as time passed. I think it depends what you mean by the full extent of the challenge. I think when we first saw the Doha deal back in 2020, we recognised that potentially was problematic. We engaged, both with our US and other NATO partners, but also as the UK independently, and the last Foreign Secretary talked about this when he gave evidence to you in September, in trying to ensure there was a peace process, which meant there was a withdrawal of the NATO military presence, which didn't lead to an outcome which wasn't in our interests. While we did that, we were, as I say, developing our plans, early planning under NSC direction, to basically achieve as much as we could for the UK and our interests, particularly keeping the UK safe in our counter-terrorism effort. While stepping up our planning, I think April was the point at which we knew that US policy was fixed, and that President Biden had ratified, if you like, the date. And we then were looking, including with the US, at how we could maintain our presence, as I said, what I think was called the Diplomatic Assurance Platform, while doing our contingency planning. I think as you move through April into May and the G7, the NATO summit and the G7 summit, that was the point at which we had assurance that there was the potential for sufficient US, I think there was also Turkish possibility, to actually allow us to maintain a diplomatic presence, and then we carried on our planning after that.
I'm going to interrupt you, Sir Philip, and ask, how many people did you estimate you'd need to evacuate when you got to the point in April where you realised an evacuation was going to be likely?
At that point, we were focused on our continuing presence. We had a central assessment around...
Did you not have any estimate at all of how many people you might need to evacuate?
I asked Nigel to come in a bit on the actual planning process, but over the period of April through to... from April the 21st, April the 14th onwards, that's when the decision was taken. From April the 21st, Joint Force Headquarters carrying out reconnaissance about what Operation Pitting, as it became known as, might look like. We then stepped up our engagement through May and June, including with PGHQ, harden up our planning. But Nigel, would you like to say a little bit about the numbers behind that contingency planning?
Thank you. To answer your question, Chair, we estimated that on the basis of historic data, passport issues, that there were something like 3,000 British nationals, British passport holders still in Afghanistan in April. It's one of the reasons that we, at that point, changed our travel advice to strengthen it to encourage everyone to consider leaving, and that there were at least 4,000 people potentially eligible for the ARAP program who remained to be put through the program and taken out. And at that point, the plan, as you know, was to get them through the process out to the UK and resettle in advance of any potential need for an evacuation.
Okay, so you're talking of a total of 7,000. So are you surprised by the figures that have been given to us by Mr. Marshall of between 75,000 and 150,000 people who applied for refuge in the UK?
So I think it's important at this point to distinguish between what we're talking about. There were, in the end, 3 ways in which people were evacuated. So were those under the ARAP scheme, led by the Ministry of Defence with the Home Office. They were British nationals, and then there was a decision to bring special cases, as they were known, which were additional in a sense to our original planning assumption. There was never an application process, so I don't recognise that the very large numbers you were talking about. The numbers we had in our minds were the ARAP scheme, the British nationals, and then a decision when we realised we had capacity, we bring some of the most vulnerable, which we did.
When did you agree what the conditions were to be counted as a special case?
Sorry, Chair, I missed your question.
When did you agree the conditions that would allow somebody to be counted as a special case? When did you set the policy?
That decision was taken as Afghanistan was taken over by the Taliban, when we had the plans in place and we knew that there would be spare capacity beyond those entitled under ARAP and as British nationals or their dependents. We looked at who else, and ministers took the decision to add the special cases, as it were.
Okay, so in April there was no intention, for example, to offer special assistance to Afghan judges who had sat on narcotics trials under British support.
There was the ARAP scheme, and that was the scheme under which people who had helped us could be brought to the UK.
Sure, but narcotics judges in the special narcotics courts wouldn't have counted, for example.
So the ARAP scheme was administered by the MOD. There were criteria for those.
Yes, and the judges wouldn't have counted as part of that ARAP scheme.
But if they were not directly employed or weren't working closely enough, they'd be assessed under the scheme whether or not they would or not be.
So would members of the National Directorate of Security who held in their minds the secrets that the Secret Intelligence Service and GCHQ had shared with them for the previous 20 years, would they have been eligible under the ARAP scheme?
Members of the NDS were covered by the scheme. I mean, Nigel, do you want to add any more about the criteria on the ARAP scheme?
Yes, thank you. So under Category 4 of the ARAP scheme, Chair, there was provision for those who had not been directly employed by us but had worked in particularly closely in special enabling roles, such as the categories you referred to be considered under Category 4 of ARAP.
And yet, despite that, you thought that there'd be you estimated there'd only be 4,000 people in the ARAP scheme.
Well, that was the estimate of the number based on what we knew about people who had applied at that point. Now, the number of applicants grew significantly as the situation worsened through the course of the summer. And so by the time we got to evacuation, we had higher numbers, and it's an open scheme, and so people are still applying today.
And did you assume that more people would apply as danger loomed closer?
Well, we dealt with those who applied at the time. We made assumptions based on the number of people that we thought we could get through, and then accelerated the program of planned charter flights. I should stress that when I say we, this was a program led by our colleagues in the Ministry of Defence, jointly administered by MOD and the Home Office.
Okay. So, Laurie, you reportedly warned on the 2nd of August that the Taliban were likely to take Afghan cities. What response did you get?
So, thank you, Chair. Well, I think I would describe the reporting that I was sending in as a kind of constant dialogue, actually, with London, where I was describing what we were seeing happening and trying to interpret what it meant in terms of our core objectives, and trying to sort of think forward a little bit to what happens next, with recommendations, proposals for what we should do as a result. So in terms of the response from London, I think what we were seeing playing out was a scenario that we had envisaged and had planned for, and the response that I was getting from London was the response that, yeah, we need to accelerate our ARAP processing. We need to refine our contingency planning. We need to work ever more closely with the MOD on what would happen if the government fell. But the key point here is that at the time of sending in that telegram, it was not a given that the government would fall or that the military would collapse. That happened over the course of the following week, 7 days. A scenario, it's no more than a scenario, which I think we were all working to as one of several, was that the government might or might not hold a number of regional capitals, but that it might well succeed in holding Kabul. And then we will be dealing with a government that wasn't in control of the whole country, but one that didn't precipitate the sort of collapse and the fleeing of the government that we saw on the 15th.
So did the FTO take steps to speed up the evacuation plans at this point? Did you take...
I arrived in post in June, having spent the previous several months working on the transition planning back in London. I would say that we were all apprised. I was certainly pushing from Kabul to try to up the pace as far as the system could manage for bringing out people eligible under ARAP. Certainly it was the case that our planners, the military planners in PGHQ, were refining at increased intensity what pitting would look like. By that stage, I think also it's worth bearing in mind that we did not know, if it came to it, which of the graduated response options we would be in. So if you think of how PGHQ do their planning, it's a range of options from fairly benign, where you've essentially got civil airlines running, through to what we had, which is most definitely not benign. And again, just an illustration of that, Emirates, the civil airline running into Kabul, was running up until the 15th of August. So the last Emirates flight attempted to land, turned back. That was the speed with which events developed.
That's clearly a relatively rapid change of events. But when you arrived in June, did you look around and realise the responsibilities that the UK had to many people in the country, and realised that the numbers and the estimates that Nigel Casey's team had pulled together were lower than you would have wished?
So the responsibilities, first of all, let me set out what was the direction with which I arrived from the NSC. First of all, I think it's important for the committee to understand that as part of the transition planning, we had reduced the size of the NSC. We'd reduced it from a ceiling of 115 staff to a ceiling of 75, precisely so that we were able to manage the risk to staff and the risk to evacuating those staff if it came to it. So what that meant in terms of prioritisation, my direction from the NSC, was first of all focus on supporting the government. Without the government to which I was accredited, we could achieve little to nothing. Second, the all-important national security task, particularly counter-terrorism. Third, getting through the casework on ARAP. And the working plan was to have completed the caseload on ARAP by, I think, the end of August. And fourth was to get the contingency planning poised. In terms of the numbers, this was always, I think, I hesitate to describe it in these terms, but as a known unknown. We did not know how many people would come forward on the day for evacuation, if that's what it came to, because we did not know how many British passport holders were in Afghanistan on any one day. We had no way of knowing. What we did know was that if we were at the higher end of the scenarios that I've outlined, there would be a surge, a rush on the airport. And that will be compounded for us by what was happening with the Americans, what was happening with our other NATO and other partners.
Did it not seem likely that the surge may resemble other such moments where power was collapsing around, and that therefore we would see not just those who would directly employ the embassy guards or whoever it may have been, but also those to whom we, or rather to those who felt that we owed them a duty of care, including people who may have been relatively remotely connected, and therefore the numbers were almost bound to be significantly greater than the numbers that you thought?
I think that honestly was top of everybody's mind during the planning phase, but I repeat, it was one of a number of scenarios. And the one that we had, as it turned out, was the one that followed from the precipitate cascading collapse of the military and of the government.
So, General Dickie Davies, who, as you may know, served as an engineering general in ISAF over a number of years, submitted some evidence in which he commented that we appear to not have thought through our responsibility to those who worked with us in adopting and promoting the values that are now, because of our withdrawal, at risk. Would you agree with that sentiment?
No, I wouldn't agree with that sentiment. I think we had a pretty good idea, I think, of how the collapse of the state, how the return to power of the Taliban might impact on people who'd worked with us. You mentioned earlier women judges. I would extend that pretty much to almost any woman who aspired to work outside the home or to be educated, to LGBT people, to people who'd worked with us, worked alongside us, not necessarily for us. But again, what I come back to is that it was not a given that the end would come in the way that it came or at the time that it came.
No, I think we can agree that the speed of the final collapse was possibly quicker than anybody thought. But surely after the withdrawal from Bagram, it was a matter of weeks, not days, or weeks, not months, rather, and it was a matter of, and the end was pretty clear, that it was unlikely that the Ghani administration was going to survive, and therefore that the government was going to survive.
Again, Chair, the way I would describe it in the last week to 10 days was a cascading collapse. At the beginning, at the fall of Zaranj, I don't think I would necessarily extrapolate from that to the fall of Kabul, the fall of the Ghani government, only 9 days later. That's what happened. I should just add that there were efforts going on in the final day or so to manage a softer landing, negotiations between some of the leaders of the Republic, some in the Taliban, for the Taliban essentially to hold short from the city. I'm sure you've been briefed on that by other witnesses, and I think it's in the public domain, but that on the day is not how it worked out.
Okay. And may I ask, during those brief months that you were in post as Her Majesty's Ambassador in Kabul, what contact did you have with the Foreign Secretary?
The Foreign Secretary, through the department...
No, what direct contact did you have with the Foreign Secretary?
So I'm looking at... My diary is imperfect, I'm afraid. It was rather a messy situation. I had contacts with the Foreign Secretary directly a number of times, several times during August, during the crisis. In the period when I was working on the transition planning, regular, and several times a week alongside Nigel as we worked through with him, how we proposed to stand up the embassy after the military had left. By the time I arrived in Kabul, I think things had moved a little bit on.
And what contact did you have with your neighbouring posts and indeed with possibly neighbouring states? So what contact did you have with, for example, our High Commissioner in Islamabad or our ambassadors in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan?
I had several conversations. I kept in touch fairly regularly with Christian Turner in Islamabad, as you would expect. It was an absolutely key part of the jigsaw puzzle, particularly because of the work that we were pursuing with the Pakistani state and the Pakistani military on trying to find a way into essentially a military stalemate and some sort of negotiated settlement.
And did you have any contact at all, or did anybody from any direct employees of Her Majesty's government have any contact at all with the Taliban before they took over the administration of the country?
I'll defer to Nigel on that, if I may. I didn't. I was accredited to the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, which is a quite important point in this respect.
Nigel?
The answer is yes, Chair. I had contact in the company of other US and European special representatives in my first week in the job in May. We had long had contacts with the Taliban. We did not declare those publicly as a matter of policy, and we kept them at the level of me as a special representative or lower. But yes, we had contacts for many years. And
did any of those conversations include conversations about assistance with evacuation or indeed support to civilians after or should they take power?
Well, when I began this job in May, the conversations were all about pushing them to live up to the commitments they'd made in the Doha Agreement to negotiate a power sharing agreement. We gave them very clear warning that if they sought to take power by other means, then one of the consequences would be almost certain forcing withdrawal of foreign embassies and ending lots of the foreign assistance which went through the government of Afghanistan.
Okay. Now, may I come back to the period over August when things started to go awry? When did you realise that it was all over, Sir Laurie?
I was tracking with particularly our military colleagues really from the fall of Zaranj onwards where we thought this was going to go. From that perspective, the things that I was most focused on were what were the things that would actually put the Republic's ability to survive and to continue to hold Kabul at serious risk. I think the key moments there were probably the fall of Kandahar, the fall of Mazar-e-Sharif. Earlier than that, of course, the Taliban had made extensive gains across the country. They controlled the border crossings. They controlled the main roads around the country, which put an economic stranglehold on the country. I think the absolutely key moments in the final couple of days were when it became clear that the military were no longer viable. I'd put that around the 13th, 14th of August. Nigel may want to comment on this, but that was the point at which our military, the US, the general who was running the diplomatic assurance platform, said, "Look, this is falling apart now." And then, of course, President Ghani's disappearance from the scene on the 15th.
I think that was the last moment. So you were alerting London pretty clearly by the 13th, 14th that it was over.
That was what was happening. Until Ghani actually fled the city, I don't think anybody could say that it was over because there was still this option in play of trying to manage some sort of, I describe it as essentially negotiated surrender to the Taliban.
But effectively, the Afghan government by the 13th, 14th had not only lost control, but had no perspective of regaining any form of control beyond perhaps the Ark Palace.
I think that's probably correct.
Okay, and that's what you were reporting to London. Okay. And at that point, you were reporting that presumably through the normal DipTel network. Were you also sending personal messages direct to key personnel to make sure that they were fully aware of the danger that the UK mission was facing?
Yes. I'll bring Nigel in, if I may, on this because he'll be able to give the London perspective on it. But I don't think there was any serious doubt that was the situation. And of course, what that precipitated was decisions around the future of the mission.
Indeed.
Chair, if I may add, on the basis of the reporting that Laurie and the senior UK military representative, Brigadier Tom Daly, was sending back, not just to me, but into the almost daily Whitehall meetings chaired by the Deputy National Security Advisor. I put a recommendation to the Foreign Secretary on the 11th of August that we needed to significantly downsize and move our embassy from the green zone in the city to the airport. That's a recommendation that he immediately accepted, and we began acting on the 12th.
Okay, so you would say, Nigel, Mr. Casey, that by the 11th of August, it was clear that the position of the British Embassy in Wazir Akbar Khan in central Kabul was no longer a viable option, and the sensible thing to do was to move the embassy complete to the airhead.
The judgment that I'd had to make, Chair, and put advice to Sir Philip on every week since June had been whether we could fulfil our duty of care, which is that in reasonably foreseeable circumstances, could we keep our staff safe and could they do their jobs? And by the 11th of August, I concluded that was no longer possible operating from inside the green zone and we needed to relocate.
Okay. And so, Philip, the embassy was, by this point, about 75 strong. That's correct?
That's correct, yes.
Would that make it one of the larger or smaller British missions around the world?
At 75 UK staff, there would have been additional Afghan country-based colleagues. It would have been a medium to large. It's quite a considerable number. Obviously, it had been much larger. We'd already taken a decision earlier on, given the increasing risk in Kabul, to bring the numbers down and to really prioritise the work around the highest priority national security work on the one hand, and the work on the Arab scheme to bring people to the UK as we accelerated that programme. Those were the two main focuses that Laurie and the team had. And then as Nigel has set out, we then came down from 75 to 20 as we chose to move to the airport to be more secure.
But you'd say that even on the 11th of August, it was still a significant mission, and presumably for you on the 11th of August, the prime focus of your duty of care responsibilities around the world?
I think that was probably the riskiest place. We had that sort of size of people, and we do have other parts of the world, Somalia, Libya, other places where, colleagues work in dangerous and difficult circumstances, and
but if you were to do
paid particular attention to our duty of care. But yes, Kabul, Afghanistan was the top of the list.
Right. So Kabul was the top of the list. On the 11th of August, the embassy was moving. On the 13th, it was clear that the military could no longer hold. And on the 15th, the president fled the country. That would be a correct summary of those few days, would it? What day did you return from holidays, Philip?
So I'm happy to go into dates in a minute, Chair, but let me just say before I do that, I have reflected a lot since August on my leave, and if I had my time again, I would have come back from my leave earlier than I did. I did put in place, as I think you know, cover arrangements, both an acting permanent secretary in the normal way, but also a director general to lead in parallel on our Afghanistan work, and I stayed in touch with the department all the way through the period closely through August. But as I say, I do. If I had my time again, I would have come back from my leave earlier.
Okay. Well, look, I think we welcome the candour with which you expressed that. It does still remain a concern that the Foreign Secretary was on leave, and you'll remember the session that he had before this committee in September. It does strike this committee certainly as strange that while the Foreign Secretary did come back eventually, you decided not to.
As I say, Chair, I've reflected on that, and if I had my time again, I would have come back from my leave earlier.
Okay, what day did you actually come back?
I came back on the 26th of August.
And where were you?
I don't really want to go into
okay, let me ask the question differently. Were you in the United Kingdom?
I was partly in the United Kingdom, partly not.
Okay. Have you ever changed your holiday plans in a crisis before?
I have, yes.
Yeah. Would you consider it normal for staff to do so?
Chair, as I say, I'm at risk of repeating myself. I have reflected on this. There's a lesson for me in all of this, which I accept. And if I had my time again, I would have come back. Earlier. May
I ask, going back to the first question I asked you, do you consider yourself a Crown servant or a civil servant?
I'm both. Formally, I'm a civil servant, a member of the diplomatic service, and a civil servant. Crown service is a wider term, but I think civil servants are a legal thing. Also crown servants, in that we work, through the government today for Her Majesty, as all civil servants do. Okay.
Alicia, you wanted to come in quickly.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm sorry, I don't think it's enough to say mea culpa. How, in 2 weeks, at no point did you go, I can't. I have to go in and protect my people? Because it would take me to the question of How would you define duty of care? You said just now we pay a particular focus to duty of care. Is that just the staff at post? Because what about the staff sat in the crisis centre?
So I'm risking repeating myself. I have reflected on this, and if I had my time again, I would have come back. But I did put in place senior cover, both an acting permanent secretary and a director general who was clearly going to be there and available to lead our Afghan work. I made sure that we had the systems in place going back months, and Nigel's already referred. I was very closely involved as the situation of our colleagues in Kabul became more dangerous, putting in place a system firstly of weekly reporting to me. We then brought it down to more frequent reporting as the situation became more acute. I was confident that we had a system in place to discharge our duty of care.
So on that, how I struggle, and I should disclose I've worked in the crisis centre as a Foreign Office member of staff. This was a catastrophe. This was not all the other things going on that we'd like to say, oh, well, there are lots of other things going on. This was a catastrophe of incomparable nature that Mr. Marshall set out in his evidence, issues around no staff being conscripted properly into the crisis centre, no linguists, no computers, no access proper for visitors, no night shift system. Do you therefore think that those you put in place to take your role in your absence failed at their duties?
So let me come on to, given you've mentioned Mr. Marshall, and we saw the witness statement he's given. So I take the issues he's raised very seriously indeed. He emailed me on the 31st of August. He'd spent 4 days as a member of the crisis team, and he said in that email that he was going to share information with this committee, which I think he had already done at that point, and also said that the Civil Service Code had been breached. I asked to see him and did indeed see him later that day, given the serious nature of what he had said, and I set out for him his options in raising concerns, and B, that we would cooperate with this committee in any inquiry you would subsequently have. And I was confident, I think, Chair, you may already at that point have said there had been inquiry, that we would cooperate with the inquiry, and we'd also, as we always do in the department, carry out a lessons learning exercise. We stayed in touch with him, and I decided that we should, given his genuinely held concerns, treat him as a whistleblower under the formal whistleblowing procedures. I used those to appoint a senior former head of mission who had not been involved at all in the Afghan crisis to look into his concerns, to talk to him, but also those involved in the crisis response. And she did that, and she found no evidence that the Civil Service Code had been breached, and she acknowledged that staff working under huge pressure had done their best to deliver the right outcomes.
That takes it back to my
she also made some.
I apologise, Philip, but that takes it back to my original question, which is, did those who in your absence had to step up fail then?
No, I don't think they did fail. As I said right at the beginning of this session, it was an extremely complex and difficult crisis. We did, enabled by the military on the ground very bravely, making sure that it was secure enough in Kabul, led in difficult circumstances by Solori, managed to evacuate 15,000 people. I do acknowledge there were things that we could have done better, and we all wish we could have got more people out, and there are, I'm sure, lessons we can learn.
I'm going to come back to the structural problems much later. Did you ever visit the crisis centre at any point?
Yes, I did. I visited the crisis centre when I was in London. As soon as I was back, I was in the crisis centre. I've been a regular visitor to the crisis centre. I also kept in touch with those leading the crisis.
Will you send us the dates of those visits, please?
Sure.
Because I'm not aware of any visits that have been recorded. And Mr. Casey, can I ask how often you visited the crisis centre?
I was there every day. I was acting as Gold Crisis, so I was sitting in the crisis centre throughout.
That's interesting again, because I would say that Mr. Marshall, while he had to point out that he doesn't actually know what you look like, Mr. Casey, which is surprising if you were gripping the crisis centre, that a civil servant wouldn't have any idea, because I'd like to point out the crisis centre is very small. I've spent many hours in it.
So let me just say a little bit about how our crisis system works. So what you can't do when we responded 24/7. We ended up, I think, as the Foreign Secretary took you through when he gave evidence, with 500 people plus working in a 24-hour period. You can't rely on a single individual to be the gold crisis leader. So Nigel had the primary role, but there was a rota of goals and making sure that we had 24/7 cover, including at the leadership level of our crisis response.
But surely, if a leader is gripping, the people in that room should know who those leaders are.
I think people did know who Nigel was. I think people did know who the golds were. I don't think anyone can be there 24/7.
Final question from me, Chair, because I'm aware there are others. If this isn't what failure looks like, and I will come on to the specifics of why I think the civil service crisis system clearly failed in this, what does failure look like?
As I say, we successfully evacuated 15,000
No, I'm
people.
sorry, this isn't about the headline stats. This is about the system, the bureaucratic civil service system that should be running a proper crisis centre, fully staffed, to the levels that needed. Mr. Casey, you said this, Sir Bristow, you said this was a scenario we envisaged and planned for. So if this isn't failure, what is?
So we declared a crisis. We went through the gears in putting more people in. We ended up with 500 plus. We had more than 1,000 people
Where were the
across.
500, please?
So some of them in the crisis centre, some of them were working elsewhere, some of them were working in our network.
And where is elsewhere?
Well, some of them could have been working from home. And so the point is that you can't, particularly during a COVID time, have 500 people working in one space. It's about what they're able to deliver.
I'll leave it there for now.
Stuart, do you
Thank you, Chair,
right
and
now?
apologies to members and to our witnesses for being late for the beginning of the hearing. Sir Philip, can I take you back to the issue of holidays? The committee has found it incredibly difficult to get any kind of information or accountability from the department, and in particular the former Foreign Secretary, as to what he was up to, who he was talking to, what he was discussing, as the Taliban was advancing across Afghanistan towards Kabul. When did the Foreign Secretary go on holiday? What date did he leave the country?
I'm not sure I have that date in front of me. I think on the Foreign Secretary's holiday, he dealt with that in...
Never told us the date.
He dealt with his holiday in his evidence.
No, he didn't, I'm afraid. I'm afraid he didn't. He did his usual bluster. He accused me of a political fishing expedition. But what I'm actually interested in here, Sir Philip, is accountability. And it's a matter of public record. When the Taliban was taking various towns and provinces across the country, what I would like to do is match the dates that they were taking over various parts of the country with his call logs and who he was talking to, when he was talking to them. And as a part of that, I'll be honest with you, when I asked him when he went on holiday, I thought he'd just give me a date and we'd move on to the next question. But he refuses to say the date himself. Now, the general consensus seems to be it was on or around the 4th of August. Would you recognise that date?
I don't have the dates in front of me, and I'm not going to speak for the previous Foreign Secretary.
No, but the department would know when its Secretary of State left the country, no? That wouldn't be an unusual thing for the head of the department to know.
As I say, I don't have the dates in front of me, and I'm not going to speak for the previous Foreign Secretary.
I'm not asking you to speak for the previous Foreign Secretary. Does the date exist somewhere in the Foreign Office that you can go back after this meeting, get it, and send the date to the committee?
I'm happy to take that question away.
So it does exist?
There's a system for ministerial cover, and I'm happy to take away the question you asked me.
So the system for ministerial cover will contain the date the Foreign Secretary left, presumably, and you'll share that with the committee?
As I say, I'm happy to take it away.
What does that mean?
I'm happy to look at the information we hold and consult the previous Foreign Secretary.
Well, he won't want you to tell me because he didn't tell the committee himself. Is there a reason why we can't get the date? I mean, we know he was at the country, we know where he was, we know all this stuff about a beach being closed. Why can we not just get the date he left the country?
So I'm happy to take that away and consult the previous Foreign Secretary.
You look delighted to take it away, Sir Philip. Can I come to the call logs? Because I've submitted some written questions looking to find out, as I say, on the dates that the Taliban was advancing in key cities and provinces in part of the country, to kind of map that beside who the Foreign Secretary was talking to and when. Can we get the call logs of who he spoke to on key dates?
I thought that we had written already, the previous one had already written to the committee about who was in contact with whom. I think we did share a long list. I don't know, Nigel, whether you can. I think a long list of ministers are in touch with which foreign countries all the way through.
Well, we never seem to get the proper black and white detail. I'm in particular interested in the then Foreign Secretary's phone calls. I've had some information about Lord Ahmed and Lord Goldsmith, but I want to know who the Foreign Secretary was speaking to, not because I'm on a political fishing expedition, but because I think accountability matters. I know that's unfashionable with ministers at the moment, but I think it does matter, and it matters to this committee. So can we get the full August call logs for the former Foreign Secretary and the date that he went on holiday?
So, unless Nigel wants to come in, I think we did write, and the former Foreign Secretary did write to the committee about who was talking to whom. But Nigel, do you want to add anything on this?
Yes, just to confirm that following your questions at his oral testimony session, he wrote on the 15th of September with a number of answers to some of your questions that he promised, and attaching a table of all the calls and meetings and other interventions at his level and by other ministers in the relevant period.
Just, I'll bring this to a close because I'm conscious other members want to come in. Nigel, do you know when the Foreign Secretary went on holiday?
I don't know the exact date, is the honest answer, no.
And just lastly, when did the Foreign Secretary in July or August speak to Secretary Blinken or the Secretary General of NATO?
I don't have that in front of me.
Can we get that?
We can look at it if it wasn't in the letter that Nigel's talked about.
That wasn't. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Bob, you wanted to come in?
Thank you. May I ask you some questions about Raphael Marshall's comments and the evidence that he's given us, which I'm sure you've probably had a good look at in the newspapers and elsewhere today. Do you think his comments are fair, as he does make some fairly strong allegations?
So, as I said, his central point that he made that we looked at was that there'd been a breach of the Civil Service Code, and as I said earlier, in answer to an earlier question from Alicia, a very senior diplomat who had not been involved at all, looked at that and found no breach of the Civil Service Code. She did point to some issues, but she did say very clearly that under huge pressure, people had done their very best to deliver outcomes around the evacuation. I think overall, some of the things he say are the sorts of things we'll look at in our lessons learning. Other things I don't think are fair.
Okay, parking the breach of the code, he makes some quite telling criticisms on individual and specific things. And one of his strongest criticisms seems to be a sort of woolliness, which sadly I think some of us have encountered before with some FCO thinking, an over-optimism, an over sort of hopefulness that you had tens of thousands of people coming forward and you ended up helping very, very few. We sent thousands of emails, most of which seem to have gone completely unanswered, and for all we know may simply have been binned. So that allegation about the amount of information that you were dealing with, the amount of people and the amount of emails from MPs, could you comment on that?
It's a perfectly reasonable question. I think the first thing to say is we received a monumental amount of correspondence. So I think it was something like 180,000 pieces of correspondence in August, nearly 250,000 in total. 19,000, I think, was the peak day, and that compares at the height of the COVID crisis. I think we got about 14,000 in 2 months. So it was a very, very high volume. Secondly, in terms of what we did about that, we prioritised basically the work to get people onto flights and to go through information we'd received to see whether that led to us wanting to look at more people rather than replying to each individual piece of correspondence. Now, I recognise very much, particularly in the House, that meant that you around this room here and also across the House weren't getting replies. We then, after as we could, we basically put in place additional resource to work through all the cases and give you all replies in September, as you know. But that was the decision we made, was to prioritise looking at the correspondence rather than answering it.
I just think we felt that we were getting false assurances that this was being taken care of, when in fact you were being overwhelmed. And I don't know if that's a lack of honesty, a lack of clarity, a lack of, just levelling us about what you can do.
So I think, 250,000, the sorts of volumes we're seeing were incredibly difficult to handle. As I said earlier on, in terms of the three schemes, the one around the special cases wasn't an application process. It was, we agreed categories with ministers and then looked for people within those categories who were given the space we had available. I do think, to acknowledge your point, I do think one of the things that we're looking at in our lessons learning, I think, we took very seriously what this committee said around call handling and COVID, and we have put in place more capability on that side, as the last Foreign Secretary said to you when he gave evidence in September. We will want to look at how we create more contingency resource if we face correspondence as opposed to calls on this sort of scale in future.
And on two specific things, if I may, do you think you all approach this? And look, the problem is with these circumstances, suddenly they become overwhelming very quickly. So I have some sympathy, clearly, with the position that you were in. Look, you're on holiday, it was August, it wasn't the best time for a crisis to happen, but crises, tend to choose the worst times. Was there, looking back, frankly, a lack of urgency and a lack of grip? And that's why you found yourself collectively so overwhelmed so quickly?
I genuinely don't think it was about lack of urgency or lack of grip. I think it was about the scale and complexity of the circumstances we all faced. Okay.
And on the specifically, and again, slightly depressing issue raised by Raphael when he talks about work-life balance, that everyone was being told not to work long hours and to make sure you've got your 8 hours, don't work more than 8 hours. And I'm sort of thinking, actually, this is a once-in-a-decade sort of crisis. Okay, we've had COVID, so it's twice in a decade. These things are very rare, and actually there comes a point where people really have to put their shoulder to the grindstone. And if you've got soldiers at Kabul airport working around the clock, I mean, people clocking off after 8 hours, not bothering to come in for a weekend, it's all sort of complacent and woolly and waffly and unfocused and sort of just a bit rubbish, isn't it?
I simply don't recognise that. I think it's based on a misunderstanding. There isn't a clocking off culture at all in the FCDO. We spend more time actually trying to persuade not to work too hard and to burn out. In terms of the 8 hours, when we're in a full-blown crisis, it's very tense. We do have an 8-hour shift system, and we make sure, therefore, that people are getting a period of rest and then coming back onto shifts. I think that's a fairly standard 24 hours, 8-3 shifts. Sometimes, depending on the time zone and the pace of work in a crisis, we might have a long day with 2 shifts. In this case, we went to a three shift system. I mean, Nigel may want to add, but I really don't recognise what was said.
Just on that shift system, you had enough people to do the night shift, because he's implying that because you sort of had this work-life balance, which is very important, don't get me wrong, that actually some of the time you didn't have the backup that you needed to have.
This wasn't about work-life balance. This is about rostering shifts in a crisis to make sure people don't burn out in a crisis and work too long in one period of time.
I'm just coming off that 1 second.
Very briefly, and then
it's a common. It's recognised, I think, unanimously across the Foreign Office that there is an issue with never enough people for RDTs, which is why we have to go across government. Every time there is an RDT application, so rapid deployment team, who will most likely be brought in to staff this, you don't get enough people. I have never, in my time in the Foreign Office, ever seen a crisis where they were able to fill all the slots without constantly coming out and asking for more and more and more capacity. So I find it very difficult. In fact, I find it incredibly plausible, is the other way to put it, that there were not enough people filling night shifts. And that the idea that we had only one person at some points on the special cases inbox, that is not enough. So I find it, I'm looking for you to persuade me, and I don't feel that there is grip, and that these night shifts were properly filled, and that there was conscription of staff onto this crisis.
In terms of the overall response, I mean, the first thing to say is, since the way as a department we are organised is we're not a contingent organisation. We're basically organised and funded to deliver day in, day out around the world, and that's the nature of our business. But we do have and want to have a crisis response capability. Over the years, as we've gone through big crises, we've looked at how best to do that. So, for example, after the hurricanes crisis in the Caribbean in 2017, where we did have problems, we looked at how best to do this, and we created a system called Directorate Crisis Lists, which allows us to access people from each different business unit, if you like, of the department to staff crisis. One of the things we are doing as part of our lessons learning process is looking at the extent to which that worked effectively, how we can be more agile, how we can be able to access contingent capability without reducing significantly our ability to deliver day in, day out business. But Nigel, did you want to add anything around the kind of staffing issues in August?
Well, to answer the direct question, so when it was clear that we needed to increase staffing rapidly and significantly, we went through the acting PUS to all directors general in the organisation, and they were all asked to produce a certain number of staff by a certain date. So there was that element of compulsion for the whole organisation to contribute, and that is what happened.
So on the nights of Sunday 22nd of August to Monday 23rd of August, and Monday 23rd of August to Tuesday 24th of August, I understand that there was no night shift allocated at all. Are you happy to say today that there absolutely categorically was a night shift for the special cases team, but also beyond that, and will you put that in writing as well as a follow-up?
Well, I can tell you that there were night shifts rostered from the 14th of August onwards throughout the crisis. So there were three 8-hour shifts every 24/7 period. I can't tell you the precise numbers in every single team on every single bit of the operation every single night.
Was it rostered? Doesn't mean they actually turned up. So are you absolutely certain that there was a night shift on those evenings and every single evening? Because I understand that people did not turn up that evening.
Well,
or those evenings, plural.
I don't want to give you misleading answers, so I'll have to check that and come back to you.
See, I would just add, Chair, that I would have hoped to hear, of course, there was not one evening where we did not have a fully stocked team delivering exactly what was needed across every single team in the crisis centre. And it is quite clear when you're sat in the crisis centre, if there is an empty team, it can be seen very easily.
Can we just go on, sorry, Claudia, and then I'll come to you.
I just want to come back really on an earlier point of clarity, and I just want to just ask Sir Laurie, on the 2nd of August, it's reported that you sent a diplomatic cable warning that we are entering a new dangerous phase of the conflict and that it was likely the Taliban would take cities. Can you confirm that that was correct? And would you have expected that soon after that the Foreign Secretary to have gone on holiday?
So I think my telegrams as published speak for themselves. What I was trying to do, as you would expect, I think, in the circumstances, is tell it as I saw it. So we were seeing major developments on the battlefield. We'd emerged from Eid and from a kind of ceasefire, and we'd seen an escalating pattern of attacks actually in Kabul as well, including probably the most important was the unsuccessful attack on the Defence Minister's house, which was actually a couple of blocks over from my residence. If he'd been at home, they would probably have killed him. And we'd then have been in a rather different phase. There'd also been the rocket attack on the government as they were at the end of Eid prayers. I don't have anything to add, honestly, on the Foreign Secretary's holiday arrangements.
Would you have expected the Foreign Secretary to have gone on holiday?
No, I come back to the point that we could see that the situation was moving into a different phase, that the Taliban were upping the level of violence. They were becoming more and more challenging across the country, including in Kabul. But we did not know the timescale in which this would end or how it would end.
What would you, in terms of the plans to put in place, what would you have expected in terms of those plans in relation to the Foreign Secretary, in relation to Sir Philip Barton, in terms of their ability to be present and for you to be able to have some communication?
So what I would expect, I think, would be what happened. That what I was trying to do in those telegrams is to alert the centre to what was unfolding. Of course, that wasn't the only source of information. I mean, I've done 2 director jobs in London and dealt with multiple crises. You absorb information and you synthesise it, and the centre's job is to work out what that means in terms of our top-level priorities, and to try to think forward where we might be a week, 2 weeks, months from now.
The situation got worse, of course. The Prime Minister went on holiday. Sir Philip Barton, your counterparts in both the Ministry of Defence, also went on holiday. Were you aware of that? And the Home Office, your counterparts, the permanent secretaries, also went on holiday at the same time you were on holiday.
So I think all permanent secretaries who are away put in place other arrangements. I described the ones I put in place.
But does it sound like joined up thinking and planning to find that yourself, the permanent secretaries in the MOD, the Home Office were also on leave?
Sounds very joined up to me.
Sorry, Sir Philip.
As I say, permanent secretaries, when they're away, put in place cover arrangements. So, some departments have second permanent secretaries. Those that don't will have an acting permanent secretary covering an absence.
Sure.
Okay, Royston.
Can I come back to Bob Seeley's line of questioning? I was on holiday too, as it happens, and I didn't come back either, as it happens. But I was working every day as an extra pair of hands in my office. Not only was I on Zoom meetings with this committee, but we were on Zoom meetings with the Foreign Secretary, with the Defence Secretary. Now, I'm sure you did that too, Sir Philip. I'm not suggesting that you didn't. But we spent a lot of time going through requests for people that needed help, hundreds and hundreds, which involved thousands and thousands of people, to the Home Office, to the Arab Scheme, to the Foreign Office, which we received few, if any, replies from. Yep. In the evidence we've had passed to us today, it suggested that a lot of those emails went completely unopened or unanswered. I'm still being contacted now as a constituent MP from people that ask for help, think they're still waiting for help, yep, but may well now discover from this evidence that people in the Foreign Office didn't even open their emails. How many of those unopened emails exist? And how many of those people have not even had their cases looked at?
So we, as I said earlier, received an unprecedented volume of correspondence, and we took the decision to prioritise identifying people for evacuation rather than replying. We're looking, as I said earlier, at what contingent capability we might be able to put in place. In future, if we received a similar volume, we believe we've replied to every member of Parliament who brought cases to us. If that's not the case, please do let us know. And we've also sent replies to all the separate correspondence we had, not from members of Parliament. But I recognise that we'll have made mistakes, and we're grateful for collaboration we've had from members' offices, throughout the periods. We've tried our best to provide information to everyone who's approached either you or us directly.
Suggesting that everyone that contacted you with people that were asking for assistance received a reply from the Foreign Office. Is that your?
Or well, it will depend on whether what we're asking about referred to the British National, in which case it was for us, or if it was somebody who was proponent under the Arab scheme, would have gone to the Ministry of Defence as the lead department for that scheme, or if it was under the special cases and leave to remain arrangements, which the Home Office lead on, would have gone to the Home Office for them to deal with.
Hundreds, thousands of people who may have qualified to leave didn't have their cases looked at, perhaps.
No, I did.
Who authorised the prioritising of animals over people?
There was no prioritisation of animals over people.
Who took the decision then to evacuate animals over people?
There was no decision to evacuate animals over people.
How then did animals evacuate before some people?
I'm not sure that's right in terms of timing. Nigel wanted to come in, but there was a charter flight arranged for animals. We helped enable that charter flight. There was no prioritisation of animals over people.
How did then that charter flight get in, and how did those people and animals get through to get to their charter flight if it wasn't using British troops and resource?
Nigel, do you want to go through the detail of this case, because it's important?
Well, just to confirm what Sir Philip has said, there was no prioritisation of animals over people. The animals were flown out on a charter flight chartered by the Nowzad organisation. That flight left only after we had concluded evacuating people. And at that stage, at the airport, it was only UK military who were left, and they were able to provide a certain amount of assistance to make sure that charter flight got out, and then they left themselves.
For now.
May I just ask, following up on that, so how much staff time did it take up to handle that process?
I don't know.
Did it take up staff time that could have been used for anything else?
I don't know how much staff time it took up. And what.
You've just been telling us that there were limited resources, so I'm just curious as to how much staff time was
as Nigel said, the evacuation of people had ended by the time that flight took place.
Okay, could the evacuation of people have been continued a few hours?
No.
Why not?
You could have.
Because the period in which we were allowed to evacuate people had come to an end. There were very clear timelines set for how the evacuation period would end, and then we moved into a new phase of withdrawal of the people enabling the evacuation.
According to whom?
I don't understand.
According to whom had the timeline ended?
Nigel, you set out the detail of who took the decision on this, but it was a very clear, the US had the principal lead, obviously our military were also involved, and I'm working backwards from the deadline for the completion of the overall withdrawal. Working back from that was what was the last point at which people could be evacuated. But Nigel, do you want to go through that in a bit more detail? I don't know, Laurie, also had from the ground.
Yeah, so Chair, the PJHQ were in charge of the evacuation, as you know, under the leadership of Admiral Sir Ben Key. They advised us of when the last available flights were to take out civilians, so Laurie and the remaining civilian staff who've been helping evacuate civilians. We obviously took advantage of those flights to take civilians out safely at the last possible opportunity. Thereafter, the only British military flights were to take out our own soldiers.
So there was no extra staff time or military time or any extra resource at all used for the evacuation of the Nowzad contingent?
Well, the permission for the charter had to be sought and supported by our Ministry of Defence to get that charter permission to fly out, but it didn't detract from the operation that we had run to evacuate civilians. It didn't stop any civilian being evacuated.
You can understand, I think, where I'm going with this question. If the gates were able to be opened to let another group through, whatever that group contained, could it not have been opened to let through, for example, the 5-year-old son of the interpreter I was trying to get out?
I understand exactly why you're asking the question, Chair. We operated on the basis of advice coming quite rightly from PJHQ, who were running the military evacuation, the flights on which we depended to get civilians out, Afghans, British nationals and ourselves. And we followed their instructions and took people out on the timetable that they gave us. I don't believe it was possible that anybody else could have been evacuated who was not going on that specific charter flight, which is not a UK flight.
Cool. As far as I understand it, from having spoken to the military commander on the ground and indeed the then PGHQ commander, now Admiral Sir Ben Key, the principal obstacle to evacuation was not air capacity, but the ability to get people onto and off the airhead and to process people. Is that correct?
Well, it was the reason that we ended the evacuation when we did was that our efforts to negotiate extra time that the Americans had led with the Taliban did not succeed. We all hoped to let that the evacuation could run on for days more, but the Taliban did not agree to that. And that's why the evacuation ended when it did. The UK military had to leave before the US military did, and that was the basis on which these decisions were taken.
I understand that's not quite the answer to the question I asked. Am I right that the constraints were to do with the ability to enter the safe area of the airhead and then the ability to process people?
Well, that was one of the constraints, but Laurie on the ground may wish to speak to that question.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I entirely understand the point. I think, we all left Kabul, thinking about the people that we weren't able to get out, and that's natural in the circumstances. It might help the committee if I talk through just a little bit, some of the constraints in the final days, and I think it will help to answer the question. So, first of all, you're right in the sense that there was an increasingly compelling constraint in our ability to get people through the system. So through the Barron system and onto the airfield when we had the Barron. Of course, after the 26th of August Islamic State attack, we had to close the Barron down in short order, move our staff, move remaining people in the queue onto the airport to a backup location that we had there and try and process them through. Another factor in play here was that the Taliban themselves were becoming increasingly, to say the least, uncooperative about letting people come forward to the vicinity of the airport or onto the airport. The number of gates was closing down, partly as a result of that, partly as the Americans took their own decisions on that. And of course, as Nigel has explained, there was a sequencing that needed to be followed to safely close down the operation, get our military civilian staff out, which, with the cooperation, the very active cooperation of the brigadier on the ground, we managed to squeeze that timetable, but within the parameters of the possible. As far as the did the operation around the animals displace people? And I've checked this, with the commander on the ground. His take, it's the same as mine, that no aeroplane failed to land or take off because of that charter flight, and nobody would have got through the system, but didn't because of this decision to facilitate the animals onto the airfield.
Apologies, so you said that no one else would have made it through the system, but British soldiers went out, opened the gates, got these animals into the airport, and made sure they made it onto the airplane. We have lots of planes, so those soldiers actually instead could have been sifting through applications. The tens of thousands still stood outside Barron's Hotel. I know because my friends and family were stood outside, not family, my friends and their family were outside and they couldn't get in. Surely those soldiers could have been processing those individuals, because we know soldiers were processing people to be able to go home, people who had permission to come. So how, in any way, are all those soldiers processing animals, taking them, escorting them through, not being delayed from being focused instead on sorting people and putting them onto planes? Because clearly more planes were allowed to take off because their plane took off. We could have had a British plane. Those soldiers could have been sifting those people and who were outside waiting, who had permission to go, and getting them onto a plane.
My understanding is that the issue in the final few days was not planes or capacity on planes.
Exactly. No, that's exactly my point. Capacity issue was soldiers and sorting people to get them onto planes. So I'm arguing that those soldiers who were escorting animals could have been sorting through people who had permission to be on planes and getting them onto a plane.
I'm not sure that the trade-off is that simple.
And what is the trade-off?
Well,
why couldn't we have done more? Why couldn't those soldiers have been sifting people and getting them onto the plane? What was the bureaucratic problem that stopped them?
Well, in the final days of the evacuation, so the period from the attack on the Barron, through to closing the operation, I think about 4,000 people came through the system. That was it was essentially completing the queue of people that we had.
There was no completion of the queue.
Of course there wasn't any completion of the queue, but it was the completion of the people who were in the system, in the Barron system at that stage. So again, if I could just spell out what happened. We had the attack on the Abbey Gate outside the Barron. We had to essentially close down the Barron Evacuation Handling Centre. We had to move our staff out of there. We had to move the people out of there who had been processed and were in the processing. We had to relocate them onto the airfield to a very, very, frankly, basic backup site and complete the casework in the time available, which was by that stage extremely constrained. In terms of the workflow, I can't say that with certainty that soldiers were actually physically moving animals through the gate. I would need to check the facts of that, to be perfectly honest, but it's not my understanding. I checked this with Brigadier Blanchard. It is not my understanding that anyone could have been got out but wasn't as a result of the animals being brought onto the airfield by their owner.
I know it's painful, Sir Philip, and you've said you've reflected on your holiday. I just want to return to it for one question. You've effectively apologised for not coming back on holiday. What difference would it have made if you had have come back?
That's a good question and something I've reflected on. So I think in terms of the overall response, when the government responds to big international crises involving multiple departments, the normal model is for Director Generals in different departments to work, both for their ministers, but also into the centre of government where the coordination happens, and that's what happened in this case, and then obviously in the STDO case, the sort of crisis structure underneath that we've talked about. I think the thing that when I reflect on this, that was a reason, one of the reasons behind why I've said what I said at the beginning is I think I should have been more visible to our people who were working on the crisis. I was involved and in touch with the department throughout, as I said, but they should have seen me visibly involved.
Would it have made any difference on the ground? Would it have made any difference to the people whose lives were at risk in Afghanistan in getting them out had you been back? That's the important reason for your existence, really, isn't it, in this case?
I don't believe me being present in London as opposed to on leave and keeping in touch with the department would have changed the outcome, the number of people who are evacuated.
Couldn't be bothered.
An interesting question. So, sorry, I again returning to a question that the chair asked you. You said you had an incomplete record, or was that effect, of your telephone calls with the Foreign Secretary. Why is that? I would have expected an ambassador to have a pretty perfect record if they talked to the Foreign Secretary.
As I said earlier, when I was working on the transition planning before deploying to Kabul, both Nigel and I, as the director, saw the Foreign Secretary regularly, several times a week, as we worked through the implications of that. I don't recall having a conversation with the Foreign Secretary in my period from arriving in Kabul to the onset of the crisis. There's no particular reason why I think I would need to do that. Certainly when there were Cobras taking place, the Foreign Secretary would have been on those. During the crisis itself, a small but quite important consideration here is that I didn't have a PA. Essentially my diary was run kind of on the run through the day. So what I can't do is go through my diary and say at this time, on this occasion, the call was there. The reason for that is that we needed to be very, very cautious about the numbers of people we had in Kabul. So I think the number of FCDO and Border Force staff peaked at, I think, 33 in the course of the August crisis. It would, in my view, have been wrong to have anybody at risk in Kabul who did not absolutely have to be there processing people. So, that, I'm afraid, is the answer to the question.
It doesn't really answer the question, but from the period of the start of August to the 15th of August, I understand it was a period of intense pressure, but talking to the Foreign Secretary must lodge in your memory. It's not, as you've said, it's not something you do every day. So you can see why this committee wants to know the answer to that question. How many times did you talk to the Foreign Secretary?
So I talked to the Foreign Secretary one-on-one, essentially, at least twice that I've managed to find in my diary during that period, and a number of more times when both he and I were in the same COBRA meeting.
So twice in the first fortnight of August before the fall of Kabul. Thank you for that. Records were left in the embassy of people, Afghans, who'd helped the British forces and the UK. Why did that happen? And what has been the outcome of the internal inquiry into that?
So shall I start then? Sorry, might want to add. So as I think you know, the Times and their reporter Andrew Lloyd came to us at the end of August and said that they'd seen papers containing personal information, and the Times shared with us the details of 3 Afghan families whose names he told us he'd received, and the Times kindly collaborated with us over this, and we evacuated those 3 families, a total of 11 people, within 24 hours. Subsequently, the Times passes details of 6 names. 4 of those are now in the UK. 2 others weren't people who worked at the embassy but who'd submitted CVs. In terms of your question around the review, I commissioned, the then Foreign Secretary referred to this in evidence, a review of what happened and also what lessons we should learn out of that particular aspect. And the review concluded very high confidence that all physical documents and IT systems containing classified information had been either removed or destroyed prior to closure. And in respect of unclassified documents containing personal data, the review concluded that we judge it almost all will have been removed or destroyed, but we can't absolutely guarantee that. I think in terms of, and Laurie will want to add to this, in terms of what happened, we had a plan as we stepped down our presence and went through the withdrawal, including the move to the airport to make sure that we'd either removed or destroyed all sensitive information. We had a team designated to do that, but because of the collapsing time scale, the time available to do that was compressed, and we regret this very much, as it were, and regret that people were put at risk, but it was an operational mistake made under immense pressure as the security situation deteriorated very suddenly. But Laurie, you may want to add on the specifics.
Thank you. So, the key point for me is the last of those. It's, to say the least, absolutely mortifying that it happened. But it did happen. The journalist contacted us. I spoke to him several times to try to establish exactly what information he had and how he'd come by it. My understanding of the information is that he was shown some documents by the Taliban, didn't see what all of them were. He certainly wasn't able to pass either the documents themselves or everything that might have been in them to us. But what he told me is that there were 6 names. He tried calling them all. Some of them rang out. Some of them were in the UK. We've established that 4 of the 6 who were our country-based staff are in the UK. The other 2 names were not of individuals working for us, but as I understand it, people had submitted CVs. Again, my understanding from the journalist is that the people he'd spoken to, who were amongst those names, alerted him to 3 other families. And those were the people, the 11 people that we got out very, very quickly indeed. We were straight onto it, got them out, passed them through. They're now in the UK. I repeat the point that it is mortifying, I think, personally for me and for all members of staff concerned that this happened. But just to expand a bit on the context that Sir Philip gave, this was an emergency destruction of an embassy happening at extreme speed. So the destruction plan had been compressed twice from a matter of the best part of a week down to hours. This reflected the situation happening. It didn't start on day one. As part of the process of preparing the transition to the post-NATO arrangements, a lot of destruction had happened, a lot of thinning out of material had happened in the previous months. But at the end of the day, it was a mistake.
And I've not completely followed the numbers that you've been through. Are there any people whose names are in those records who are still at risk in Afghanistan, or is everybody back safely in the United Kingdom?
As far as I know, no. Nigel, do you want to confirm that?
As Laurie said, the names of the families who were passed to us by the Times we evacuated quickly in a matter of days after we had that information.
Thank you. I mean, it shouldn't really be a lesson learned, should it? I mean, it should be absolutely fundamental. If you're evacuating an embassy, you get rid of all sensitive records. Was anything else of a sensitive nature, in terms of computers, programs, anything else left behind in the embassy?
We are confident that the most sensitive material, particularly the Chancery, was comprehensively cleaned out.
And in terms of your point about, there was a plan, as Sir Laurie said, it was a 5-day plan cut short to 2 days and then to just 9 hours because of the collapsing time scale. But we absolutely take seriously our responsibilities, and one of the things we've done in light of this incident review is that as we look at other places in the world we might need to evacuate, be sure that we have put in place robust plans to make sure everything that needs to be either removed or destroyed is done so.
There has been criticism from ministers and officials in other departments that officials in the embassy left so that it was left up to soldiers to process applications to get out. What is your response to that, Sir Laurie?
Essentially, it is not the case. So I mentioned earlier that we had at the peak 33 staff in country that comprised of 20 FCDO staff, 13 Border Force staff, a combination of British Embassy staff, rapid deployment teams, actually 2 rapid deployment teams that we brought in several days apart, and 2 Border Force teams several days apart. My characterization of how things worked on the ground was very different from some of the stories that I've seen, certainly in the media. I would describe the working arrangements between us, the Border Force, the military at all levels, as something I'm proud to be associated with.
What's your current position? You're clearly not ambassador to Afghanistan anymore.
Do
you not know?
He does. No, he does. He does know. So the nature of the role changed in a fundamental way, and so Laurie and I agreed that he would step down as ambassador. We have Dr. Martin Longdon as our chargé d'affaires based in Doha, representing our interests in Afghanistan and providing continuity. But the job that Sir Laurie was appointed to, in effect, changed in a significant way, and he has stepped down from that role and remains working for us in the FCDO.
Thank you. My final question, Sir Philip. There has been criticism of the lack of coordination between the Foreign Office, Minister of Defence, Home Office. Do you think if you had been back from holiday, that the ability to centralise command would have been better, and do you think it should have been better?
I think in terms of cross-government coordination, that's obviously done by the Cabinet Office.
It clearly wasn't done by the Cabinet Office.
And that's where both us, the Home Office, and the Ministry of Defence stocked in. There were daily coordination meetings, and Nigel can describe how it worked in practice. And I think we did work effectively under extreme pressure with our colleagues across government. But Nigel, talk about the cross-government coordination.
Thank you. So, I mean, during the crisis, every single morning there was a cross-government senior, as in 3 or 4 star representative level meeting chaired by either the National Security Advisor, Stephen Lovegrove, or the Deputy National Security Advisor, David Quarry. So there was very close coordination every morning. We were all getting the same information picture and discussing the same decisions every morning, and therefore able to brief our respective ministers on the same basis. And then within the FCDO Crisis Centre, we had secondees from PJHQ to link us up directly to the to PJHQ here and to the operation in Kabul. We had civilians from the MOD. We had staff from the Passport Office, from the Border Force, and others such as HM Revenue and Customs to help with call handling. So it was a genuinely cross-governmental effort, and as Philip and as Laurie said, it was one that all those who I've spoken to have been involved were proud to be part of.
But it didn't work, did it? Because there's clearly pretty public disagreement between those people you said you were, those departments you said you were coordinating. Do you have an explanation as to why it didn't work?
I don't accept that it didn't work. We evacuated 15,000 people in 2 weeks. That doesn't happen by accident. The experience at official level, I can't speak for political level, experience at official level was of extremely close working, and as Laurie has testified, of very close relationships in very difficult circumstances in Kabul itself.
Thank you.
I'll just follow up very quickly before I come to Chris. You've spoken about how you were stretched at various points. Did you ever consider employing reserves or calling in former members of staff who had experience in the languages related to Afghanistan?
Are you addressing that to me?
Into the crisis centre.
In terms of augmentation to our crisis response, we did bring in some military personnel, not least to help with the handling of some of the correspondence, and we did augment also using the civil services civilian augmentation, which we have through HM Revenue and Customs, again to bring in more people to help with the information management and the challenge we had in that area. So yes, we did bring additional people in.
And did anybody offer? Former members of staff, did they offer to help?
Nigel, were there offers from former members of staff that you're aware of? I'm not aware of any.
We had lots of volunteers from within the FCDO, and as I say, we brought in extra resourcemen and accepted offers from other government departments as they were made.
Okay, I've been told that there were offers made by former members of staff who spoke the specific language groups.
I'm not aware of offers from former members of staff, Chair.
Chris.
Thank you. Sorry, Sir Philip, to go back to your holiday issue, but I'm going to, if you don't mind, can you just tell us when you went on holiday?
Yeah, I went on holiday on the 9th of August.
The 9th.
Just to repeat what I said.
Yeah, no, I've got it. You don't need to repeat it.
I'm going to say it again. I have reflected on this very carefully, and if I had my time again,
I
would have come back.
It sounds less credible every time you repeat it, Sir Philip. It sounds platitudinous.
It just feels a bit scripted now, but so you were away from the 9th to the 22nd, to the 26th. How much of that time was the Foreign Secretary away?
As I said, I'm not going to speak for the Foreign Secretary and his holiday.
Let me just explain why this matters, because it's the whole of the leadership of the Foreign Office at the same time. That's why this bit matters to us, because it would just seem axiomatic to me that if the Foreign Secretary is going to be away, the Permanent Undersecretary isn't going to be away.
I don't think that's actually true as an axiom. I think it's quite usual actually for Secretaries of State and Permanent Secretaries to be away in periods which are normally holiday periods. And in both cases there will be senior ministers on the ministerial side and a senior acting Permanent Secretary or second Permanent Secretary on the official side.
Can I ask you when you booked your holiday, roughly? Was it months and months before, or was it like on the 7th of August?
I'm really not going into details on my holiday arrangements.
But you see, that matters as well. Because if you were booking your holiday by the time it was obviously clear that there was a crisis, then that is a dereliction of duty.
So, in answer to your question, I have thought about this very hard. I answered Graham Stringer's question about what the impact was, and I've been honest with you in saying that I think the impact was on my colleagues. I do regret the fact that I didn't decide to come back to support them. I don't think it affected the outcome in terms of the people who were able to evacuate from Afghanistan.
The question for us might be rather different than the question for you. The question for us might be, why on earth were you going on holiday on the 9th, by which time we had a pretty clear idea of what was going on?
When I went on leave, including on the 9th, there was no inevitability at that point that Kabul was going to fall in the period that it fell in. There was no, the best assessment, it could take some time still. There was no certainty over the timescale.
I think by that time they were already talking about 31 days, weren't they?
I don't recognise
the evidence that's been given to us repeatedly, and lots of organisations on the ground in Kabul, in Afghanistan. Not so much the advice being given by the Foreign Office, but by lots of other organisations working there, was that all of this was an inevitability, and at the outside it was going to be 6 months.
So I think that is the point. I think that was our central assessment that Afghanistan would most likely fall to the Taliban. There was a great uncertainty around exactly how quickly that might happen.
Okay. So, as I understand it, the Foreign Secretary went on holiday on the 6th of August. So you were basically planning to be away at the same time for 2 weeks.
I'm not getting into the Foreign Secretary's holiday. He can speak for himself.
The problem is, sorry, forgive me for interrupting, Chris. The problem is this isn't about, and I understand your need for privacy, I perfectly understand your right to have leave. The problem is that in a leadership structure, and one on which the UK depends absolutely for its security, the concern is that if both leaders are out of the country at the same time, it does raise some very serious concerns. Now, it may not be that actually you would have had a substantive difference on this incident. It may be that you're right, that the substantive difference was only on your colleagues and being able to support the efforts that they were making in the crisis centre, though for some of us that would be still rather an important reason. And I also accept your review, your reflection of the position. The problem I think many of us have, which is why this keeps coming back, is the very idea that the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, because let's not forget that's what his position was as First Secretary of State, the Foreign Secretary, the PUS, the National Security Advisor, the PUS at the Home Office and the PUS at Defence, were all away at the same time. I mean, Sir Laurie, did you think of taking holiday around that time?
Yeah, I was in London for 4 days, around the 7th to the 11th of August, as part of a planned rotation. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with how the embassy is staffed, but essentially it's a 6-and-2 rotation. The embassy is staffed specifically so that there is an alternative ambassador.
Indeed.
At the time that we're there. Of the time I was in London, I think I spent probably the majority of it in meetings either in the office or with the office.
And you went back rather quicker than your 6-and-2.
Yes.
You see, this is kind of the point we're coming to, which is leadership matters, and it's not just about the difference that a leader can make in terms of tactical command, but about the strategic intent that it demonstrates for an organisation and the seriousness with which an organisation pursues its functions. I come back again to the first question I asked you, and you described yourself as a civil servant. You're not, sir, a civil servant. You're the head of Her Majesty's Diplomatic Corps. That is a function greater than the civil service. And it is greater than the civil service for the simple reason that you are solely charged with the powers that you hold abroad in order to exercise extraordinary powers on behalf of this government with almost no review or check. Now, that's fantastic. And that's why we're lucky to have brilliant people in our diplomatic service around the world. And by the way, I can point to 50 today and 100 tomorrow. But it does raise serious concerns that if you're effectively in the position of a Crown servant, the similar position to that of a commissioned officer of the Crown, I do know that you have warrants and you very proudly display them on your walls. It does raise some very serious concerns if that ethos isn't being followed at the head of the organisation. And forgive me, that's why this keeps coming back.
So I think I am true to the ethos of public service, Chair. That's what I try to live by. That's what motivates me in my job.
Yes.
Can I move on to a different issue then? Just because the former Foreign Secretary this morning said that there were 1,000 FCDO staff working in the crisis centre, and I think the number that's been given today is 500, but I'm not quite sure whether that's FCDO staff or not. And 500, by normal call standards would mean roughly 85 full-time equivalents, 85 full-time equivalents on a 24/7 rolling basis. Is that right?
So the 500 referred to, I think it was a bit more than 500, to the peak number in a 24-hour period. I think you divide that by 3 to get any number on a particular shift.
That really isn't how it works.
Yeah, you have 3 8-hour shifts, and so
it's really not how 24/7 works.
In terms of I think it's over 1,000. The overall number that I think the former Foreign Secretary was referring to is the total number of people from across the department who worked on the crisis at one time, or
anybody who sent an email about anything. In other words.
No, not at all. Actually, those who would have been on the rostered shifts. I mean, Nigel, do you want to say any more about the figures?
Yes, that's right, Philip. The 1,300, in fact, is the total number of staff who contributed it, who worked at some point on the crisis rostered, whether working in the crisis centre or from a post around our network remotely or from home. So that's what that.
Between what dates?
That's during the course of the crisis. The 500.
From April through to August, or?
No, this is in the course of the evacuation period. So 15th, let's say from the 15th of August to the end of August.
Could you give us, and that's all FCDO staff, not from any other department?
The 1,300 is FCDO staff, I believe, yes.
You believe. Could you just give us, I'm not asking you to give us 1,300 names, but it'd be really good if you could give us an indication of what departments they came from, sort of broad categories of numbers, because 1,300, 1,500 just sounds very suspiciously round. I don't buy it, if I'm honest. And it certainly doesn't equate with anything that I've heard from other officials in the department or from the evidence that has been given to us.
Okay, we can write to you with a breakdown of how we arrived at that number.
Can I go on to special cases? Because I note that everybody keeps on saying this has been a wonderful success. You managed to get so many hundreds of people out under special cases and so on. But there is an alternative argument which has been put to us, which is that actually the way that this was all structured was a terrible mistake. We had 3 different systems running at the same time, run by 3 different departments. One of those systems is not yet up and running at all. One of them was run by the MOD, which was the ARAP, and a third was the creation of this special cases category. And because there was simply so much coming through, we ended up not really prioritising properly. We ended up basically licking a finger and sticking it in the air. So can I just ask, when was the special cases concept devised and by whom?
So ministers took a decision on or around, I think it was the 16th of August, that in addition to the Arab cases and British nationals and their dependents, if there was space on flights, we would extend the evacuation to others, the so-called special cases.
And when you say ministers decided, what does that mean, and where did they decide that?
So Nigel, can you describe the ministerial decision-making process on that?
The key ministers involved were the then Foreign Secretary, the Defence Secretary, and the Home Secretary. As Philip says, they had been clear with us up until that point that the overwhelming priority in terms of for evacuation were British nationals and their eligible family members, those who had been accepted under the ARAP scheme. Yep. And then in the week of the 16th, it was decided by those ministers that if there was spare capacity, when PGHQ advised us there was capacity on flights, that we would look to prioritise additional Afghans who did not fall into the first 2 categories.
But help me a bit here, because the normal process of ministerial decision making would be on the back of a report that's sent up from officials, or ministers saying, we're interested in doing this, officials, is this a possibility? Was there a paper that was considered, or was this just, they sat in a room, they came up with a view and told you, right, we're creating this special cases category?
Well, ministers met, I think, 6 times in the course of this crisis in COBRA format, and I believe it was from one of those early meetings that the decision was taken that we should, in response to the calls that were coming through from members of Parliament, from NGOs and others, to do what we could for people who did not fall into the first 2 categories, that we should indeed respond if and when we were advised by PGHQ that we had capacity on those flights. So that was always the basis of this scheme.
So Mr. Marshall told us, in what I have to say it was an extraordinarily well argued document, and it seems a great loss to the Foreign Office that he's no longer with you, but I'll leave that to one side. He said in paragraph 35 of his evidence, which I believe you've all seen, haven't you? I believe the Foreign Secretary had approved a submission including a list of categories of people to be evacuated, intelligence officers, journalists, judges, etc. Is that right? Was there a submission?
Yes. Yes, there were two submissions. That's right. We were asked by the Foreign Secretary for advice on which categories of people should be prioritised. We put advice to the Foreign Secretary. He, I think, absolutely rightly wanted to take responsibility for making those very difficult decisions himself. So the way the process worked was that he decided which categories should be prioritised, and then we were then tasked with prioritising within those categories individuals according to a set of criteria which have been agreed by ministers.
Thank you. Can I suspend the session as there's a division bell being called? Order. Order.
10 minutes to get.